3/4 of species on Earth were wiped out in the 5th mass extinction. That includes the dinosaurs. 66 million years later, and scientists warn that we are now entering the 6th mass extinction, and it's caused by people. Extinction rates are well above normal. More than 300 vertebrate animals have been exterminated in modern times. Most that remain have declined enormously. For example, 40% of mammals have lost more than 80% of their former range. For insects and other animals without backbones, the picture is worse. Considering just the land snails, we may have already lost over 1,000 species. To help address this biological annihilation, the United Nations Environment Programme set up the Convention on Biological Diversity. 196 countries, that's nearly all of them, have signed up to the 20 targets under their strategic plan. To figure out how well the targets were being met, the Convention on Biological Diversity set up some indicators to measure human actions as well as aspects of biodiversity that should improve under each target. These indicators are potentially important. They tell governments and the community what we need to achieve to save biodiversity, as well as measuring progress towards targets. But most of the indicators so far are showing that things are getting worse for biodiversity. The biodiversity crisis is escalating despite nearly all nations agreeing to the targets set under the Convention on Biological Diversity. What is going wrong? What if we take a step out from what is being done and consider the full range of processes that drive biodiversity loss? So we have this disastrous loss of biodiversity, including loss of ecosystems, species extinctions, and range contractions that erode genetic diversity. Directly causing this biodiversity crisis are the direct threats: urbanisation, agriculture, mining, roads, hunting, recreation and war, dams and fires, invasive species, pollution and climate change. And each of these immediate threats have direct drivers, the threat industries. So for example, real estate developers are the direct driver of urbanisation. The pet, horticulture and agriculture trades directly introduce and spread invasive species. These industries are in place to meet the increasing demands for resources by a growing human population. The number of people and how much each person consumes are the fundamental drivers of the biodiversity crisis. Right at the top of this hierarchy of drivers sit the instigators, society and government. The combined actions of society and government can modify the impact of threat industries through regulation, corruption, funding for the environment and knowledge about biodiversity. So how well do indicators represent the components of the biodiversity crisis hierarchy? A count of the number of indicators reveals some startling gaps. Even though government, corruption, mining and roads have enormous influence on biodiversity, they had no indicators. And while human population size is a fundamental driver of the biodiversity crisis, there is only one indicator related to that. Another way to evaluate how well indicators represent the hierarchy is to look at the scope of each component of the hierarchy relative to the scope of the indicators. For example, the aspects of society that influence biodiversity loss includes beliefs and culture, individual actions, effectiveness of NGOs, and corporate social responsibility and corporate political activity. But of the 16 indicators for society, 10 were about measuring benefits from nature, 1 was about individual choices, and 1 related to NGOs' role in protected areas. There was nothing about political donations, nothing about cultural pressures to consume, and nothing about religious influences over population growth, such as access to contraception and education about family planning. By considering the scope in this way, we find that only consumption has high coverage, 4 have medium coverage, and the rest have low or no coverage. These gaps emphasise that part of the solution is to develop new indicators and new targets that cover all of the components in the biodiversity crisis hierarchy. But the biggest part of the solution is for all of us to recognise where these drivers intersect with our everyday lives. You can take action to reduce the flow-on impacts for biodiversity. This includes the simplest actions like voting for a party with strong environmental policies or consuming less meat, right through to big commitments like strengthening environmental NGOs or leading the charge to increase the capacity of society to limit family size and resource consumption. Action is needed across the entire biodiversity crisis hierarchy to get a better outcome for biodiversity and for people.